I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington, and this week on Face the Nation, Democrats defend President Biden after a disastrous debate, and a new CBS poll reveals whether it changed the way voters see the candidates now. President Biden's team sought out Thursday's debate to draw a contrast with Donald Trump and hoped it would soothe concerns about the incumbent's age and stamina. Instead, after a meandering, frequently hard-to-follow performance, not even Mr. Biden's closest supporters could ignore the obvious.
It was a slow start. That's obvious to everyone. I'm not going to debate that point.
That was strike one. If this were a ball game, he's got two more swings.
The president went on damage control.
When you get knocked down, you get back up.
And spent the weekend at fundraisers as critics outside some of those events and the nation's leading newspapers called for him to step aside. Mr. Biden said he's staying in the race, but some voters are voicing doubt.
I'm not so sure he's as sharp as he should be.
After what happened last night, Democrats should have woke up today with a plan B.
We'll have results of a new CBS poll. Maryland Governor Wes Moore, who is campaigning for President Biden, will join us. Meanwhile, despite repeatedly making falsehoods on stage, former President Trump claimed victory.
We had a big victory against a man that really is looking to destroy our country.
But his legal problems could cut that short as the Supreme Court prepares to rule tomorrow on whether former presidents are immune from criminal prosecution. We'll hear from possible Trump running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Plus, we'll check in with Congressman Jim Himes, the top Democrat on the Intel Committee, and get the latest from the head of UNICEF, Catherine Russell, on the humanitarian crises putting millions of children at risk around the world. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We begin this morning with reaction to the first presidential debate of 2024. Our polling unit asked voters how they view the candidates now, including their cognitive health. The results are not encouraging for the president. The number of voters who say President Biden has the cognitive ability to serve has dropped from 35% earlier this month to 27% after the debate. That's the lowest number since CBS began asking voters that question last September. Nearly 3/4 of all registered voters now say he shouldn't be running, and nearly half of Democrats say he shouldn't remain the nominee, an extraordinary number for an incumbent who didn't face a competitive primary. We should also note that half of all voters also say former President Trump does not have the cognitive health to serve. Voters give former President Trump a significant edge, though, when asked which candidate explained his ideas clearly, inspired confidence, and appeared presidential. Joining us now to discuss all of this is Maryland Governor Wes Moore. He's in Milwaukee, where he has been campaigning for President Biden's re-election this weekend. Welcome back, Governor.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Governor, it wasn't a good night for the president, and I'll save us time because I know you're going to tell us, look at presidential performance, not debate performance. Everyone has a bad night. Barack Obama once had a bad night. But at 81 years old, this is a different set of factors for President Biden. Why was he struggling Thursday?
Well, I think both candidates struggled. I don't think either candidate had a very good night on the debate night. But I also do know that it does matter when we're looking at presidential performance and not necessarily debate performance.
But respectfully, Governor, the president doesn't do many interviews. He doesn't do things where we have to see him be quick on his feet. He's not here. You are.
Well,
He's not on the campaign trail as often as surrogates like you are. Isn't that demonstrating that there are alternatives, Democratic alternatives, who are younger and able to go out and be quick on their feet and on the trail?
I know I got a chance to see the president when times were difficult and see him in trials. And
Yeah.
I've seen him being able to be a remarkable partner to us. And that's what I remember, and that's why I continue to believe that the Biden administration deserves another 4 years, and I'm excited about what that can deliver for the American people.
Why was the president struggling?
I think the president had a tough night. I think
Why?
all of us have difficult nights. Well, I think that the president had a difficult night, just like every single one of us do.
Governor, I know that Democrats believe that abortion is a winning issue in this election. Here's what the American people heard from the president when he was asked about abortion.
Look, there's so many young women who have been, including a young woman who just was murdered, and he went to the funeral. The idea that she was murdered by an immigrant coming in, they talk about that. But here's the deal: there's a lot of young women who are being raped by their in-laws, by their spouses, brothers and sisters, it's just ridiculous, and they can do nothing about it.
Abortion is an important issue for Democrats. This should have been a layup. He was struggling to make the point. How do you explain that?
Margaret, that wasn't a great moment for the president. And no one can argue that it can. He was also standing feet away from someone who was talking about politicians who take babies away after they're born and killing them. He was also standing feet away from somebody who was debating whether or not the limit on reproductive health should be 6 weeks or 9 weeks or 12 weeks, or saying that any politician should have a say about what happens with a woman and her body when that conversation should exclusively be between her and her doctor.
Right. But
And so
Donald
it
Trump
was not a great moment for the president, and we can't defend that.
Yeah.
I think and Donald Trump is also claiming responsibility for the turn down of Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it wasn't a great moment for the president. But let's be clear, his position on making sure the reproductive health and reproductive rights should be ironclad, his position that we should have Roe v. Wade as the law of the land is very, very clear. With Donald Trump, I want to be also clear that that is not his position.
I understand you want the conversation to be about the policy and the false statements made by his opponent. But the Atlanta Journal and Constitution in Georgia, a key state for the president, came out in an editorial saying this wasn't a bad night. It was a confirmation of the worst fears of some of Biden's most ardent supporters. Age has finally caught up to him. It referred to excuses like what you're making as insulting to the American people. How do you respond to that?
I think that what we are watching, when you're watching a presidential performance, when you're watching a president who's able to lead us to now where we have record low unemployments, when we're able to watch how the black wealth inside of this country since the pandemic has risen by 60%. When you're able to watch a presidential performance that's been able to do things like raise wages for our workers and making sure that our rights are protected, that does matter in this conversation. And so I understand people who are, and I understand and I get it, the arguments about age and the complications of 81. But the number 81 is an important number, but so is watching historically low unemployment rates. And I do not think that people should lose sight of that.
Sure, but we're not just talking about 3.5 years in the past. We're talking about 4 more years, bringing him to age 86. Here is what the president responded when he was asked about the national debt and how he would tax billionaires.
We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
The president lost his own point.
We also have to remember that this election is a binary choice. It's an election between President Joe Biden and, frankly, even the conversation around the national debt. Someone whose tax cuts at a time when over the next decade we are going to have the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world.
You
and a president
need young
and a former
voters
president
to turn out Democrats need young voters to
That's
turn
right.
out. How are they supposed to see themselves
That's right.
reflected in that?
I think they're also going to see themselves reflected in all the people who are going out and being the president's surrogates. I think you have to go out and earn it. You know, I'm the youngest Democratic governor in this country, the only African-American governor in America. And we're out here all the time. And we're out here in conjunction with other surrogates. We're out here in conjunction with the president who's out here campaigning and the vice president. We're going to the people and we're making our case to the people as to why this kind of partnership matters. Progress does not happen by accident. The work that we are seeing, I look at the state of Maryland. We now went from being 43rd in unemployment when I was first inaugurated to now having amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country for 12 straight months.
So would you pursue the Democratic nomination if Joe
rates.
Biden were to take himself out of this race?
I will not. And Joe Biden is not going to take himself out of this race, nor should he. He has been a remarkable partner.
Are you confident that the only person, the only Democrat in America that could beat Donald Trump is Joe Biden?
Joe Biden is our nominee. Joe Biden is our leader. And Joe Biden has earned and Joe Biden deserves the confidence, the respect, and frankly, the partnership that we now have to provide to him. And so I will be in Chicago. I will proudly be supporting the president in Chicago. I will work through November to make sure he gets reelected. So yes, I do think that President Biden has earned the respect of Democrats, and Joe Biden is going to be our leader going forward.
Governor Moore, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Face the Nation will be back in 1 minute. Stay with us. We turn now to Ohio Republican Senator J.D. Vance. He joins us this morning from Cleveland. And Senator, I should say we're having some technical issues, so you're with us on Zoom. Hopefully our uplink stays solid throughout, because I got a lot of questions for you, sir.
Sure.
Donald Trump had a better night on Thursday during that debate by many measures. But according to our poll, he fell short on at least one of them. Fewer voters thought the former president was truthful compared with President Biden. Mr. Trump falsely claimed states are passing legislation to execute babies. I think you know that killing people is illegal in every state. He falsely claimed that the Speaker of the House at the time turned down 10,000 soldiers that he had offered to keep the peace ahead of January 6th, something his own acting Secretary of Defense testified to Congress did not happen. If he has such a strong platform, why make false claims?
Well, Margaret, I think the media is running interference on a lot of this stuff. We all know, and Nancy Pelosi herself has admitted on camera that she could have requested more National Guard troops. She bears some responsibility for the fact that they weren't there at the Capitol. We know that the multiple Democratic governors and states, and even some Democratic senators and congressmen, have tried to pass laws that would effectively legalize abortion up until the moment of birth. And most importantly, we know that the media seems totally uninterested in fact-checking Joe Biden from any of the number of false claims that he made.
You know, I've lost track, sir. I've been told the media's on every single side of this and everything's our fault. But let's get back to the candidate you're here to talk about. Chris Miller said 10,000 troops. He was never ordered by the president to send those to the Capitol that day.
Nancy Pelosi has said on camera, Margaret, that she bears some responsibility for the fact that the National Guard didn't play a bigger role. And of course, we know the Speaker of the House has an extraordinary amount of influence over the Capitol Police. It's not in dispute, Margaret. And more importantly, Joe Biden said that no troops died on his watch, even though 13 American service members died thanks to his botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Joe Biden made multiple statements of falsehood during the debate, and a lot of folks in the media, yes, seem totally uninterested in fact-checking him. And the reason, Margaret, is because Donald Trump just performed so much better. There was this 24-hour period where effectively everyone was honest that there was an incredible contrast between Donald Trump's energy and command of the facts and Joe Biden's obvious inability to do the job as president. And now, of course, we've this new media cycle where folks are trying to run cover. Look, the American people saw what they saw. Trump can do the job. Biden can't.
Yep. You might not have heard it, but I did raise a lot of those issues to Wes Moore, the Biden surrogate who was on before you. As to where you stand on some of these issues, tomorrow at the Supreme Court, it may be a significant day as we get expected to get that decision on presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. And that's directly relevant to the federal charges against Donald Trump, as you know. You're a lawyer. I wonder, if you become the vice president and you are in a Trump-Vance administration, do you believe a president could pardon himself for federal crimes?
Well, look, I'm focused on electing Donald Trump as president, whether I'm serving in some other role, serving as United States Senator. I think the Trump agenda has worked, Margaret. And on this particular
Would you
question,
object if the president were to try to do that?
Margaret, we know that the president has to have immunity to do his job. Should Barack Obama be prosecuted for droning American citizens in Yemen? There are so many examples of presidents, Democrats and Republicans, who would not be able to discharge their duties if the Supreme Court does not recognize some broad element of presidential discretion. I'm very confident that they're going to be able to do that. And I'm very confident that the fundamental principle here is the president's got to be able to do his job. In the same way that police officers, judges, prosecutors enjoy some immunity, that principle has to apply to the president too.
So you do believe that a president could pardon himself for federal crimes?
I believe that the president has broad pardon authority, Margaret, but more importantly, I think the president has immunity. It's not about whether he should pardon himself. It's about whether he be prosecuted in the first place for discharging his official duties. So in that way, I sort of reject the premise of the question here. We need to have some recognition that a Democrat wins the presidency. They try to throw the Republican president in jail. A Republican wins the presidency. They try to throw the Democrat president in jail. That is the pathway to unraveling 250 years of American constitutional tradition and making the president totally unable, regardless of party, to do their job. That is not a good thing, and it's not something I think any Republican supports.
Okay, to that point, President Trump on that debate stage on Thursday suggested that Joe Biden could be criminally prosecuted after he leaves office. It wasn't clear exactly what crime he was alleging, but he mentioned something about the U.S. border. In a Trump-Vance administration, would your Justice Department prosecute Joe Biden? And if so, for what?
Well, first of all, that would be the responsibility of the Attorney General, Margaret. But Donald Trump did not say that he's trying to throw his political opponent in jail. That is Joe Biden, who has in fact already tried to do precisely that. And importantly, what he said is that if you applied the same standard that Joe Biden's Justice Department has applied, then there are a lot of Democratic officials who could go to prison. He's making a fundamental argument about constitutional fairness. It's so extraordinary that people could say that Donald Trump is the one trying to use lawfare against his opponent sometime in the hypothetical future, when in the very real present, that's exactly what Joe Biden is trying to do.
But do you object to the premise?
And I think that what we need to recognize is that applying a consistent standard is what really matters.
So you would not want the Justice Department to prosecute Joe Biden for any alleged crimes?
I want people who, Margaret, I want people who commit crimes to face the appropriate response in law. What I do not think is reasonable is for Joe Biden to weaponize his own Justice Department, going after Donald Trump, any number of crimes, some of which have already been thrown out, a number of which I think will be thrown out, including on Monday by the United States Court. So the problem that I have, Margaret, is not with which Democrat should prosecute which Republican and vice versa. It's let's get out of the prosecuting of people based on their politics. Let's let voters decide who the president should be, not judges and prosecutors who are politically motivated.
Senator, you are, as everyone knows, on this very short list of potential running mates for Donald Trump. So for our viewers at home, you are 40 years old. You've been in the Senate for less than 2 years. You haven't held elected office before this. If you are selected alongside a nominee who is 78 years old, you will be a heartbeat from the presidency. What do you think your biggest accomplishment in the Senate has been to date?
Well, Margaret, again, I'm not running for vice president, and it's important for us to remember that Donald Trump has been a very good president. He will be a very good president again. I think in some ways, these vice presidential conversations serve to distract from the fact that we have Donald Trump as president was a success. Joe Biden as president has been a failure. Let's get back to success. Let's get back to peace and prosperity. My attitude on the vice presidential thing, Margaret, is look, if he asked me, I want to help him. And of course, I would be very interested in the job. But you asked, what are my accomplishments in the United States Senate? In 18 months, Margaret, we've done a lot of good work for our constituents. We've got hundreds of millions of dollars to the Great Lakes. We've done a lot to help the people of East Palestine deal with the terrible train disaster. And of course, we've done a lot of work on making sure that Ohio has gotten defense resources that make not just Ohio, but our country stronger. So there's a lot we can hang our hat on, but I like being a senator. I'm not trying to leave the United States Senate. It's an honor to serve the people of Ohio. And frankly, if you ask me, that's where I expect to be in 6 months. That's where I expect to be in a few years.
All right, J.D. Vance, we'll be watching, and hopefully we'll have you back in studio next time. We'll be right back.
This portion of Face the Nation is brought to you by Simply Safe. There's no safe like Simply Safe.
Tomorrow, the Supreme Court is set to conclude a blockbuster term and issue a landmark decision on whether presidents are granted a degree of immunity from criminal prosecution, a decision that could impact the 2024 race. We're joined now by CBS News Chief Legal Affairs Correspondent Jan Crawford and Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. A lot to get to with both of you, but Jan, the big question of tomorrow morning, what will the court rule?
Well, I mean, we'll see. But I mean, I do expect a decision that at least leaves open the possibility of a trial before the election. I mean, I see zero chance they're going to embrace Donald Trump's argument that he has absolute immunity and can't be prosecuted. I think they're going to say that there is some immunity for the official actions of a president. And why is that important? I agree, and you heard some of that in your conversation with Senator Vance. They are concerned that this case will apply to future presidents. They are concerned that after a bitter campaign, as one justice pointed out in argument, that the winning candidate could throw the loser into jail. They're worried about that. And as Trump said during that debate, he believes Biden's policies on immigration have been criminal. So they see this as a case that goes well beyond Donald Trump. That's why I think they're going to wall off those kind of official actions of a president, but leave open the possibility of prosecution for unofficial actions of an office seeker. And as Trump's lawyer argued at the oral arguments, conceded at the oral arguments, a lot of what's alleged in the indictment is unofficial acts. So Jack Smith could have those papers ready to go and say, he's conceded this is unofficial acts that he can be prosecuted for. Let's get this trial going. And I think the judge could do that very quickly.
It's hard to get your head around something being an unofficial act by the president when he is doing it in office, at times from the Oval Office. How do you explain that?
Because as a lower court in a different case on a similar issue explained, unofficial acts are the acts of an office seeker, a candidate, speeches you may give on the campaign trail, at rallies. So a lower court has already laid out the groundwork for how you can make these divisions in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The official acts will be those core powers that presidents have, immigration policy, decisions you make about drone strikes. Those cannot be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. That's going to be walled off. But there's a lot of things a president does that could be unofficial and criminal.
There is so much we need to dig into on the legalities, and then with you, Major, on the practicalities, because as you just mentioned, there could be a trial before the election.
You can't rule it out.
We're going to have to talk about what that looks like and the impact on the trail. Please stay with us, and we'll have the rest of that conversation on the other side of this commercial break with Jan and Major. Welcome back to Face the Nation, and we return now to our conversation with Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford and Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. Major, I want to pick up with you. Jan has laid out for us that there is the expectation the Supreme Court could say some, but not total immunity. What does this mean for the timeline for Special Counsel Jack Smith?
As a practical matter, the Trump legal effort has already succeeded. It has delayed a resolution of this matter for a very long time. Oral arguments were April 25th. Many legal scholars have said, what is the court waiting for? This is not that hard a question. But by waiting, even if there is room available to Special Counsel Jack Smith to prosecute, his choice is to launch that trial in September or October at the absolute earliest, in the very teeth of a presidential campaign in which former President Trump says, because I am potent, because I am politically leading, I am being prosecuted. Is that the political and legal terrain Jack Smith wants to wade into? We'll find out. It's the most consequential prosecutorial decision in the history of the country, if it comes to that.
And on two cases, one directly related to 2020 and attempts to steal the election, the other unclassified documents, that playing out in Florida.
Precisely.
What is the timeline on that case?
Much later. because Judge Eileen Cannon has briefed and heard arguments on so many underlying issues in that case, it does not appear ripe for a prosecution under the most favorable calendar before the election. The January 6th case, however, does.
Jan, how would the immunity ruling that you are expecting affect the classified documents case in Florida?
I don't think it would, because that, again, that case is about what he did after he left office. And I agree with Major. I see no way that the classified documents case goes forward. I think that is a very inexperienced judge, and she's taken on a lot of issues. So I see no way that one goes forward, because, again, that's about behavior that after, he's no longer a sitting president. But I do want to point out, remember, the Supreme Court did agree to Jack Smith's request to expedite this case. He asked the court, if they were going to decide it, to take it up this term and have a decision by the end of the session. And that's what he's going to get. There are a lot of people who wish, on the conservative side, that the court had just said, no, we're going to just do it regular course of business. We'll come back and have arguments in October. We'll give a decision in December or January, and that means there is no trial. So the court, and I understand there is frustration among Democrats that the court seems to be dragging their feet on this, but that's not true. I mean, the court has expedited this. They added this to their calendar, and they are going to give Jack Smith what he wanted in his filings, a decision by the end of the term that allows him to go forward with the trial.
There's frustration among Democrats that the Attorney General didn't move faster
and bring charges.
Just a quick rejoinder on that point. A 3-judge panel, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, issued a 57-page opinion on this that was unequivocal. Supreme Court could have taken that.
Right.
And they didn't like that decision because it essentially said there is no immunity. There's none. And the court believed, and I think from this conversation you can see, there is some immunity for official acts. And so the court believed, let's decide it now instead of having this go through the trial court process and come back up here challenging this. Trump would be challenging it in September, October all over again.
Jan, Friday, the Attorney General said he was disappointed that the court ruled 6-3 to limit a law that has been used to charge hundreds of Capitol riot defendants as well as President Trump. How will this affect the potential case against Mr. Trump?
That case, again, that came up. One of the January 6 defendants, along with a couple others who were charged with obstruction of an official proceeding, challenged the use of that charge in their cases. And the Supreme Court said on Friday that prosecutors may have overreached. They looked at the law that was at issue as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act after the Enron accounting scandal, and they said, the justices said on Friday, that it has to be tied to some kind of destruction or hampering of evidence. So that was a big win for the January 6 defendant in this case, Joe Fisher and a couple others, but it doesn't mean it's a big win for Donald Trump. He is going to file a motion to dismiss. Assuming this immunity case goes like we believe it will, he'll file a motion to dismiss those charges against him. And Jack Smith, I'm sure, already has legal papers to say, let me show you how this obstruction charge is still going to apply to Donald Trump. And why is that important? That carries a 20-year prison sentence. It is a felony. It is the most serious charge. And I believe that based on, again, another opinion in the D.C. Circuit that lays out a groundwork for how Trump can still be charged, they will be able to show that he was trying to interfere with evidence, the evidence of those certificates where they were counting state electors. He was trying to disrupt that evidence and the counting of those votes.
Very quickly, Margaret, just under 1,500 people have been charged with the January 6th riot. This affects less than 2% of those cases.
Major, very quickly, for President Biden to be removed from the top of the ticket, he would have to agree to do that.
He has to agree. DNC rules are absolutely clear on this. The threshold to be the nominee is 1,968 delegates. President Biden currently has 3,894. Unless he steps down, there is no mechanism to dislodge him from becoming the renominated candidate for the Democratic Party. Period. End of story. There are lots of people who are talking about it, but unless he removes himself or is somehow otherwise incapacitated, this is a closed matter.
It's a family matter at the moment.
A very important family matter, not just the family, but the broader Democratic Party family.
Thank you both for your reporting and your analysis. We'll be right back. We go now to Connecticut Congressman Jim Himes. He's the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
I know you were recently briefed regarding those arrests in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and New York City, and the 8 Tajik nationals with suspected links to ISIS-K. Do you know where we are in regard to understanding whether they were a cell working together, whether there were direct links?
Yeah, so law enforcement, as you might expect, is making pretty good progress determining who these people were talking to, what the plans were, other people involved in the network, whether an attack was imminent, whether there were specific plans for an attack. And this isn't new, right? In other words, as you know, shortly after these individuals entered the United States, not stopped because there was no derogatory information on them at the time, very quickly some derogatory information was developed. And the decision was taken to watch these guys. Now, the reason you watch these guys instead of instantly arresting them is that their behavior and their communications can really paint a very specific picture of a plot, of a conspiracy, if there is one. Obviously, they took the decision at one point that the risk-reward there was such that they made these arrests. But of course, they continue to work to understand whether there were plans, and if so, who else might have been involved.
So it sounds like intelligence is still being gleaned from these 8 individuals. So how can we say there is no active threat?
Well, Margaret, we can never say there is no active threat. There is always a baseline threat of a terrorist act in the United States. There is absolutely nothing we can do to change that fact. So you can never say that there is zero risk. What you can do is you can look at the period of time since 9/11, the tragic attack on 9/11, and say how many Americans have actually died in a terrorist attack engineered by foreigners. And the answer to that question is vanishingly small. Our people are very, very good, but you can never have zero risk of a terrorist attack.
Would you support a public hearing with the intelligence chiefs to lay out the facts as we know them? I know Director Wray said we are at the highest possible level of threat right now.
Yeah, and Margaret, look, I think it's really important for people to keep this in context. That may be true, and it's probably true because the world is a more complicated place than it was 10 years ago, in particular with the war in Israel and Gaza. We see every radical Islamic group, from the Houthis to all the Iranian-backed proxies, interested in doing things that they might not have wanted to do 10 years ago. So Director Wray may be right. And in fact, I think our intelligence agencies and law enforcement are on alert in a way they haven't been in a very long time. And look, the Tajik story is a success story. They were arrested. They did not conduct a terrorist attack.
Your Republican colleague, Mike Turner, was on this program a few weeks ago, and he said, quote, "We have terrorists that are actively working inside the United States that are a threat to Americans." Is that an accurate characterization? And if so, why not?
Well, the Tajik case is, as far as I know, the only case that we have been briefed on the Intelligence Committee of our intelligence community, our law enforcement community, following people that we think could be involved in a plot. I'm certainly not aware of other situations like that. Now, it is almost certainly true in a country of 350 million people that there are some people out there who are thinking about undertaking acts of violence. We see a lot of violence in this country. Most of it is domestic. Most of it is not related to transnational terrorism. But again, you asked earlier about a public hearing around the facts here. Yeah. And I didn't answer it directly, so I'll answer it directly right now. We're probably not at that stage because of what we started talking about, which is the absolute necessity of law enforcement really understanding the full contours of that Tajik group and doing the work that they need to do, which is best done in secret.
In terms of what's happening and the connection to the southern border, President Biden said at the debate on Thursday, quote, "I'm not saying no terrorist ever got through." So he seems to be acknowledging this unknown element here. Do you think the intelligence community has the resources they need right now to deal with the threat and the vulnerability at the border?
Of course, a border in which people are entering and we don't know who they are is a risk. No question about it. And I wish that we had seized the opportunity of the bipartisan bill negotiated by Jim Lankford and Chris Murphy, a conservative Republican and a progressive Democrat, to actually do something about that. But Donald Trump said no. He said, don't do it. I want to run on this issue. So I would have loved to have seen that get done. Sure. But again, people need to put this into context. How many Americans have died in a terrorist attack by somebody who snuck across the southern border? The answer to that question is 0. So resource allocation, should the FBI, should the CIA be laser focused on the southern border? I don't know. Clearly, it is a risk and a vulnerability. But, you know, a lot of these plots we pick up because of our collection ability abroad.
So you think the resources are adequate to intelligence collection abroad?
Well, I think if you had the head of the FBI or any of the people who are involved in this effort, they would say we could really use more resources, right? But one of the challenges we have that we haven't talked about, Margaret, is remember that for a decade now, more than a decade, we've been talking about the pivot to China. Right? China invading Taiwan is an outcome that is catastrophic in 10 different dimensions. Yeah. If we're serious about pivoting to Asia, if we're serious about supporting the Ukrainian fight against Russia, inevitably, because we don't have infinite resources, some things like counterterrorism are not going to get the full amount of resources that you would like.
Before I let you go, how do you think America's foreign adversaries viewed President Biden's performance on Thursday night?
I suspect that, you know, pretty much everybody watched that debate and thought that the president did not perform the way we would have liked to have seen him perform. However, I've spent time around 3 different presidents, Margaret, and I will tell you that the president's job is enormously hard and involves all kinds of things, none of which are standing and doing a debate for 90 minutes on TV. The president's job involves passing legislation. I would hope that people would compare this president's record in that regard with the last president's record.
Being quick on your feet is kind of important
setting
to the job.
A tone. Well, yeah, and again, I think he's acknowledged and the vice president acknowledged that that was not the performance we were looking for. But I'm not so cynical as to believe that the American people are going to choose a president based on a 90-minute debate rather than a 4-year record of startling legislative achievements and of setting a tone that the rest of the world says, wow, you know, America is back to the decent leader that we used to believe that it was prior to the Trump administration.
Congressman Himes, thank you for your time this morning. We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to the executive director of the UN agency that helps disadvantaged children in the world's toughest places. UNICEF's Catherine Russell joins us from New York. Good to speak with you again. I know you're just back from Sudan, which is the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. What did you learn?
Yeah, I learned that it is a catastrophic situation for children there, and there are compounding crises. First, it's the largest displacement crisis for children around the world. So many millions of children have moved either from their homes to neighboring countries like South Sudan, Egypt, or Chad. Many millions are moved inside Sudan to other places in the city in the country trying to find some refuge. It's also a huge challenge in terms of malnutrition. We have 4 million children who are severely malnourished. Almost more than 500,000 of those children are severely acutely malnourished, which means that they really are on the verge of starvation. And then shockingly, almost every child in Sudan has been out of school for the last year, which is incredibly destabilizing for them, for their future, and certainly for the country as well.
17 million children who are not in school.
Yeah, shocking.
Apart from the humanitarian concern here, I know the U.S. intelligence community has highlighted that Sudan could become a terrorist safe haven due to this ongoing civil war. What are the conditions like for those next generations?
Yeah, the conditions are absolutely terrible. I have to say, I was at a center that UNICEF supports where we were providing all sorts of services for children, education, which, you know, is, as we discussed, a horrific problem for them not being in school, trying to provide health care, providing psychosocial support for children who are so traumatized. It's just almost hard to imagine. It's just such a desperate place in so many ways. They're so, they've been so traumatized by so much violence, and they've seen things that no child should ever see. And that's really something that long-term is hard to imagine how they get over it. Having said that, we are there, we're working hard, we are getting to these children, but this ongoing conflict makes it almost impossible to provide a decent future for these kids.
A little closer to home in Haiti, I know this past week the first UN-backed foreign law enforcement forces from 8 different countries arrived. This is part of a U.S.-supported effort. How quickly do you think that will make a difference for the children there?
Well, I will say, hopefully it will be quick, because the children there, I mean, honestly, I feel like I'm sort of a broken record when I tell you how bad it is in so many places, but Haiti is really challenging because there's so much violence. I was shocked by what I saw when I was there several months ago. So many children who have seen violence directly, who have experienced violence, high rates of sexual violence. So it's been incredibly important to try to stabilize that situation. I think this is the first step. It's going to take a lot of work, I think, to get it done, but at least we'll start to see some semblance, hopefully, of some security, which will make it easier for us to operate, but also give these children some prospect for a decent future that isn't defined by violence and hunger, which is unfortunately what we're seeing now.
Mm-hmm. And the U.S. remains the largest donor to many of these humanitarian causes, I know. There was one rare piece of good news this past week in the Middle East. I read 21 children with cancer were permitted to be medically evacuated from Gaza. This was the first evacuation since May. Why is it so hard to get sick children out?
I'll say this, everything in Gaza is hard. It's just the most challenging environment for us to work in, I have to say. I think that, the main problem is a lack of security, and that makes it difficult for the children who live there. They've been displaced so many times. So many children have multiple times moved, trying to seek refuge, trying to get away from the bombardments. I think it's incredibly challenging. We continue to see that we're on the verge of famine there. So children, it just means they don't really know where their next meal is coming from. They also have not been in school, right? So it's an incredibly challenging place for children. And I think, it is great to find some shred of good news. And, when you think about it, you forget in these humanitarian situations, the humanitarian crisis is so devastating that you forget that there are routine problems that children face, right? Mm-hmm. They're not getting their vaccines. They're not getting treatment for things like cancer or other sort of routine diseases and challenges that children all over the world face. So getting some of these kids out of there has been, as you say, a bright spot. But I think overall, we continue to see real challenges in our ability to operate there. We need to get that situation sorted out so that children have some prospect. And I think this applies to all three of the situations you've talked about. Children are the future. We talk about that all the time, but what does that mean if we don't give them a future, if we don't make sure that they have some prospect of hope? And I think it's incumbent upon all of the adults in the world to come together and to do better by these children.
I couldn't agree more with you on that, Director Russell. Thank you very much. We'll be right back. Nearly half of the countries in the world will hold elections in 2024, and today French citizens cast ballots in a snap parliamentary election. French President Emmanuel Macron made the surprising decision to hold it after his centrist party was trounced by the far right in the recent European elections. It signals once again the uncertainty about the political changes ahead. President Macron called his shock decision a test of truth. The rising floodwaters of the far right, as Macron put it, cannot be ignored. With a call to stop the migration, this man, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, may become France's next prime minister. With a platform promising to crack down on crime and restrict citizenship and rights for foreign residents, his National Rally Party is poised to potentially win a parliamentary majority. The party, led by Marine Le Pen and founded by her Holocaust-denying father, has renounced its anti-Semitic past, but for years has rallied on anti-Muslim rhetoric and described migrants as threatening, particularly to women. Macron, who will remain as president for another 3 years, warned that the far right risked sparking a civil war. And in Germany, police broke up protests this weekend outside the AfD, or Alternative for Germany convention. That far-right party pulled off its best performance ever in European parliamentary elections, worrying Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and moving one of AfD's leaders, Bjorn Höcke, from the fringe to the fore. Höcke said he deplores the Nazis, but he's led chants of their slogans at his rallies, which landed him back in court this past week, since German law bans the use of Nazi phrases. The AfD party advocates for tough deportation policies, is suspicious of climate change and the government response to COVID. Waves of migrants, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Africa, have been fleeing to Germany since Europe's 2015 refugee crisis. Despite these emerging trend lines in Europe, it appears the center did hold in those parliamentary elections, at least for now. Center-right Ursula von der Leyen is expected to remain European Commission president. But this Monday, Hungary takes over the rotating presidency of the European Council. And Prime Minister Viktor Orban has promised to, quote, make Europe great again. The slogan a nod to his friend Donald Trump. With the far right still ascendant in parts of Europe, it has left some to wonder if America is any less immune, and leaves open the question of what happens next when democracies elect leaders who flirt with anti-democratic tendencies. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.